The challenges that anarchism is facing today, I would say there are two main things maybe for me. One seems fairly obvious, and that's maybe more of an external challenge, if you will. I mean, the powers that you're up against are extremely strong. I mean, if you're talking about the state system and capitalism and all sorts of forms of oppression that are very deeply ingrained in our society, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and speciesism, whatever you want to include there. Very often just seems so powerful that it's kind of seems to be a daunting task to really challenge that beyond creating little pockets maybe where they're not as widespread as in mainstream society or whatnot. At the same time, I think that that's one of the beauties of anarchism too, that you just always try to make that difference that you can make given the current circumstances. So even though that is possibly a permanent huge challenge, it will never cause me to conclude that it's not worth pursuing the anarchist path, if you will. The other main challenge I see, that's more of an internal challenge that has to do with, I guess, anarchist history, and then also the present state of anarchism. And now I'm really talking about anarchism as a social movement that has labeled itself as an anarchist movement, and that is commonly, if you will, understood as an anarchist movement, so a movement that has its origins in the 1860s in Europe and has as its big kind of original figures, Bakunin, Kropotkin, and others. And that is that I think, given the fact that the origins of anarchism and of anarchism as a social movement and the way it has developed was strongly connected to European Western society, and also the power structures that define that society and that were reproduced, at least partly, within the anarchist movement. What you're still facing today is the irony, if you will, that that movement is very male, it's very white, it's very middle class, and it's very Western centered, even though there are exceptions to all these categories. Obviously you can't deny the great roles that people who don't sort of fit those categories play in the anarchist movement. But the overall picture definitely looks like that. The problem obviously is that if your ideal is to provide ideas and principles that make the life better for all, but then there is only a fairly small percentage of people who embrace that explicitly, this social movement, and also a lot of them who come from backgrounds that you associate with power structures that you want to challenge or that you oppose. I think you're just facing certain contradictions. However, again, I wouldn't say that the conclusion is that our anarchism can't live up to its historical promises, or it's a hypocritical movement, or it's even a ridiculous movement because it talks about things that it can't. People in the anarchist scene or movement talk about things they want to realize in society in general that they can't even realize within their own communities. Because I think there's a whole bunch of reasons for why the anarchist scene reproduces itself in the way it has reproduced itself for over 100 years, that partly have to do with failures within the movement, but that also partly just have to do with the circumstances under which you have to do anarchist politics in the society you're in. Just to give it one example, I mean, I really think why a lot of white middle-class males end up in the anarchist movement more so than people from other social groups is because sometimes you don't have many alternatives. Like it's, you know, if you're a person of color who's against authority and different forms of oppression, there are organizations where you can organize as, you know, a person of color. So the same, you know, for women. I think, for example, if you look at a lot of social groups, projects, and movements that are labeled as feminist movements, for example, a lot of their politics are anarchist. The reason why they don't label themselves as such is because, you know, you don't necessarily want to associate with a movement that's very male dominated. At the same time, for a lot of, you know, as I said, white middle class males, if you want to fight oppression, the anarchist movement is the one where you probably feel most at home at. I guess you can't blame those individuals necessarily for that, but it also, again, contributes to a reproduction of, you know, the anarchist scene as, for example, predominantly male. So I don't think the consequence of this is, again, that you know, anarchism, it's impossible for anarchism to live up to its promises and its ideals and principles. But I think it does, you know, challenge us who are in this movement to reflect upon the role that anarchism can play in broader struggles against oppression. Even with people who, for whatever reason, don't want to embrace the term anarchism or have never even heard of the term. That's one thing. And the other thing, of course, I mean, that's ongoing. Like, I think, you know, it is important to reflect on possibilities to change, if you will, the demographics of the anarchist movement. Obviously, there are very problematic approaches like going out to recruit, you know, specific target groups to join the anarchist movement and all that. I mean, that can be very patronizing and all that. But, I mean, you know, you have to ask yourself why, for example, if you do anarchist events, you know, events, talks, workshops that are labeled as anarchist in the German-speaking world, why is it always, you know, 80 to 90% men that go there? You know, I think there are certain things that you can do, and again, partly that's explainable through the history, but there are still, I think, now certain things that you can do to change that, and I think people have to reflect upon that a little more as well. I think most people would agree that it has to. I think it's one of the most common things where everyone kind of agrees on a problem, but then for whatever reason, I think there is too little common effort put into resolving those problems. So that will be the kind of biggest sort of internal challenge that I see with anarchism today.